I'm an officer for the London Police Force, so as you can imagine, I get called out a lot while on patrol. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I've seen some weird things on the job, but the call out that makes me lock the door at night was actually a wellness check that led into many more similar circumstances, none of them being good. I remember it was around a week or two after Valentine's Day when I was asked to do a wellness check on an elderly resident after their neighbor hadn't heard anything from them in a while. It was an elderly woman of 79 years who was very active despite her age. She always called by her neighbors to say hello on her way home. So when she didn't call by for 2 weeks, the neighbors called the police out of concern. I knocked on her door but decided to enter when there was no response. I was immediately hit by the smell emanating from the small bungalow and had to fight just not to gag. I pressed on regardless after covering my nose and mouth with my arm. And that's when I found the elderly woman in a large armchair, dead. Now, I turned to leave and radio it in, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw the door to her bedroom slowly opening. I knew it was closed because I closed it while performing the regular routine of checking the rest of the home. There was also nothing strange in her bathroom when I checked, but as the door slowly creaked open like it was a horror film, I saw a man standing there in the doorway, facing away from me. I just stood there frozen with fear because someone had just appeared in the bathroom. I eventually gathered my wits and choked out the words, "Sir, please turn around slowly so I can see your face." I was going to ask him how he got in, but he just stood there, motionless like a statue. I slowly started to approach him, but then he suddenly started to move, extremely slowly, but moving all the same. "Sir, how did you get in here?" But still no response. The noise I heard next still makes me shiver, even to this day, despite everything I've seen as an officer. A deep, crackling noise coming from the man, like the noise celery makes when you break it, but being made by this man's neck as it bent and warped until he was facing me. His head was upside down, staring at me. Despite his body from the neck down not having moved an inch, his face was just... I don't even know how to describe it. It was even more unnatural than the fact that his neck should be broken at the 180 degree it had turned. His eyes were sunken voids of emotion, and his smile stretched from ear to ear, filled entirely with crooked and rotten teeth. Before I could do anything else, though, the door just slammed shut with enough force to splinter the wood. Still shaking, I made my way back to the car and radioed in. When the cleanup crew arrived, they said there wasn't anything out of the ordinary with the bathroom, except for the splintered wood. The neighbor was informed and the paperwork was filled out, so everything went on as normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling the crooked man wasn't just my fear making me paranoid. Since then, I've always heard that crackling noise and seen him out of the corner of my eye every time I find someone deceased after a call out. I'm still with the force and I'm currently waiting a promotion, but that crooked man still stalks me at the times of death. Sit down, doctor. I need to tell you something. You remember me, right? You introduced yourself to me about a week ago over the staff kitchen counter. I don't know what it was about you that made me look in your eye, but I did. I don't usually do that, and if you've observed me for a while before saying hello, you'd have known that. I looked into your eye, and now I need to tell you something I've never told you before. You might not believe it, and you certainly won't like it. It could get me fired or worse, but I have to not care right now. I have to tell you my secret. When I look people directly in the eye, I can see how they're going to die. I don't see when or why, just how. I don't know why I can see these things. It's been this way my whole life. My earliest memory is of my mother leaning in close to kiss me goodnight and seeing a flash of headlights and churning tires in the pale blue of it meant. Not then. Not until I was 7. And she was killed by a hit-and-run driver. That's when I realized what I'd been seeing. Sometimes I look into people's eyes and see the faces of another. That's scary alone. Sometimes I see the face of a person walking beside them, and that's even scarier. And there's nothing I can do about it. I learned the hard way not to interfere. The end result is always the same. Someone always dies. But if I try to stop it, my involvement becomes the catalyst for their death. When I was younger, I looked into the face of a woman just before she crossed a busy road and saw a speeding semi looming in her eyes. I cried out for her to turn back as she stepped off the pavement. She heard me. She stepped in the road and turned. The semi came. She died and I ran. Anytime I think about trying to interfere, I remember her face when she turned back towards me. I was the last thing she ever saw. That's why I work here, among the elderly. These folks have already survived anything that might try to kill them off prematurely, so I rarely see anything frightening in their milky eyes. They're dying simply of time. Too much time. All things considered, I don't think that's a bad thing to be dying of. I keep my head down, not just because I don't want to see the people around me going to perish. I do it because I've developed my own little warped theory that until I observe a person's cause of death, it can still be changed. It goes back to the woman on the road. If I hadn't looked in her eyes, I wouldn't have shouted out to her. If I hadn't have shouted, maybe she would have seen the van, got out of the way in time. There's no way of knowing, but it gives me comfort knowing that my ignorance of gruesome deaths could be the thing that allows people to live longer, less tragically altered lives. It helps me sleep better at night, anyway, some of the time. After my mother was gone, I went into care. The counselors and care workers tried their best with me, but I was well past the age of being blissfully unaware of the true nature of my situation. I knew I was alone in the world, and now I knew what the disturbing things I saw in people's eyes meant. At best, the other children thought I was weird. At worst, they were terrified of me. My young mind thought it would be kindness to warn others of how they would die, but as it turns out, people don't like to hear this kind of thing from a 7-year-old child. You live, you learn, and then you die. From then on, I shut down. I barely spoke, and I never looked anyone in the eye. They sent me for all sorts of physical and psychological tests, getting nowhere. Doctors of all fields tried to ask me what was wrong, but I'd learned my lesson by then. I didn't tell young Dr. Matthews, who gave me a lollipop after every visit, that she would die engulfed in flames in her own bed. I didn't tell Dr. Elmond with the bright bow ties that his heart would betray him. I screamed bloody murder the day I met Dr. Nicholas after seeing the face of a home intruder yielding a gun lurking behind his polished spectacles. But I can't keep quiet any longer. You've got to help me, Doctor, because I think you're the only one who will. I thought I'd learned to cope with my twisted gift, but it's apparent that I'm not coping as well as I might be. Because when I look into your eyes, the only thing I see staring back at me is myself. There's a crack in the sky. I noticed it only a few hours ago in my hospital room. I was in inpatient care because of my frequent health problems. Being in the hospital room for so long, you start to catch on the little quirks of the place. The window blinds were removed a few days prior to my arrival at 916. The TV volume will never pass 25, and there was always a perfect view of the Pittsburgh skyline. No matter how much pain I was in, I always found comfort in the sunset. It looked like the cover of some jazz music album. Such a calm sight, until I saw it. A small hairline crack in the dim sky. A nurse walked in and I pointed it out to her. She could barely make out the small crack beginning to grow. She played it off off as some sort of moonlight anomaly, and she went on her merry way. I just kept staring at the ever so slightly growing crack. An hour into staring, and I noticed something. As the night finally set in fully, there was a faint light pouring out of it, like a small flashlight being shined on something miles away. It seemed like nobody else was paying any mind. Nobody except me and maybe that nurse. I took a break from my stargazing to use the restroom. The air seemed to feel a little colder every minute. The AC was apparently fixed, and yet I was freezing in my little hospital gown. So much for a nice, cozy October night. I returned to the window, and my skin went clammy. The crack had gotten bigger, but wider now. I stared at what was now a massive gap in the night sky. It shined a near blinding light that seemed to touch down onto Earth. At that moment, I froze. I couldn't help but just stare. Deep inside the light of this crack that was as massive as the second moon, I could hear the emergency alert ringing from my phone and the quiet TV. It didn't faze me though, at least not yet. A few moments passed and I snapped out of my temporary shock, immediately messaging my parents and siblings asking if they could see the crack too. No answer. I didn't want to panic. Panicking would only make my condition worse. I glanced back at the window and my jaw hit the ground. The giant gap in space grew seemingly as big as it could. It took up around the quarter of the horizon. Clouds seemed to be warped around it, like metal feelings reacting to the wrong side of the magnet. I tried to alert a member of the staff about the macrocosmic crack in the sky that dwarfed the moon, but the door was locked. The building must be on lockdown, or maybe my door was just broken. I didn't have enough time to rationalize the situation. As I made my feeble attempt to escape my room for help, I heard a loud, piercing boom. The window shattered, sending glass to cascade the floor of my room. Thank God I was able to wear my shoes. I slowly crept back towards the window, watching the sky turn a sinister gray. Something began to crawl out of the sky. It looked like an impossible being, a face with infinite eyes and mouths slithering out of the void of pure light. I heard thousands screaming as the beast touched down to earth. It made an impossible noise that I could only describe as TV static mixed with the roar of Godzilla. My eardrums bursted, a blessing and a curse. I was released from hearing the agony that was that being's voice. My vision began to fade out slowly. The last thing I saw was that thing from the sky, laying waste to the world.